Let's just start out with what we know. Contrary to what many people believe, the holiday that we know today as Christmas was never a pagan holiday. From its inception, Christmas was always intended as a celebration of the birth of Jesus. That's a fact. And actually, there was no such thing as Christmas until the 4th century AD. However, it's also a fact that before Christmas came along, there were a lot of other holidays that were celebrated around the same time of year. Why? Well, because it is the time of the winter solstice. And the reality is that there have probably been winter solstice celebrations or rituals of some kind observed by most, if not all, cultures throughout the world and throughout human history. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. But for the sake of our discussion today, we're not really interested in the way that maybe the Aztecs or the Chinese or the Egyptians might have celebrated their holidays, their winter celebrations, because these probably would not have influenced the Christmas traditions that we celebrate today. So what are we interested in today? Well, firstly, we want to talk about the way that winter celebrations were observed in the Roman Empire. And then we want to talk about the way that they were celebrated in the societies where Christianity first spread, because these would probably potentially have had the greatest impact on the Christmas traditions that were passed down to us. And then, again, we're going to look at some of the more modern influences later, but I want to start by looking at the winter celebrations that were used in the 4th century Roman Empire. These celebrations are the ones that took place in late December or early January, and they are the context into which Christmas was born. And there's really 4 main celebrations that we need to talk about in what they called midwinter. The first was the celebration of Saturnalia. The second was Sol Invictus. The third is the birth of Mithras, and the fourth, Calends. And so the first holiday, Saturnalia, was an event that lasted a week from December 17th to December 23rd. And it began with a sacrifice that was offered to the agricultural sun god, Saturn. And that's the god after whom the festival was named, Saturnalia. And then there was like a big party. And man, did the Romans know how to party. This wasn't just like a day of partying or something. This was several nonstop, back-to-back days of feasts and orgies and loud street processions that were probably a lot like a modern Mardi Gras celebration, but were way more wild and perverse than anything that would be legal in public today. And one of the interesting features about Saturnalia was this tradition they had where masters and slaves reversed roles. And in the celebration, the tradition really, the masters would sometimes serve the slaves, and the slaves would be allowed to be somewhat disrespectful, even to their masters, I'm sure within reasonable limits, but still, it's fascinating to think about. And we're not going to get too much into that. We'll talk a little bit about Saturnalia later, but none of that stuff, the orgies, the processions, the perversity, the role reversals, none of that would really bear any resemblance to what the early church practiced, or even less to the modern ideas of Christmas. However, there were some similarities. I'm sure that the decorations would have been kind of familiar. I'm talking about things like laurel and holly and green trees and candles, stuff like that. There was also gift exchanges, which would have been familiar as well. Okay, now the second holiday we want to talk about is Sol Invictus, which is what was known as the celebration of the unconquered sun god. Now, what was all that about? Well, it's really important to remember this. There are cycles and rhythms in nature that I think we in the modern world often don't feel as connected to because we don't rely on them as much. You know, when it gets dark, we just switch the lights on. If it's cold, we turn on the heat. If it's hot, we turn on the AC. Most of us don't grow or raise our own food. We just go to the grocery store when we need food. We don't know or care what grows when or where. We can get strawberries or bananas or green beans or whatever all year round. We have freezers. We have global shipping distribution channels. We have genetically modified crops. We have pesticides and herbicides. We have chemically enhanced animals and plants, and the list goes on. So again, the cycles of the natural world, for all practical purposes, mean very little to the way that most of us live our day-to-day lives. But for people in the ancient world, this was not the case at all. They had to be a lot more tuned into these rhythms of nature because they depended on them. And these annual celebrations that pop up in almost every culture and society around the world, going back to the earliest records of human history, are usually tied to these cyclical astronomical events. And one thing you'll find is that basically everyone in the ancient world had some kind of midwinter celebration around the same time. Why? Well, every year, starting in June, the days start to get shorter and shorter for 6 months. And that happens all the way up to this day, this moment that we call winter solstice, which would be the shortest day of the year. And then after that day, the days would start to lengthen again. And actually, just to be clear, I think that's only true technically in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, the December solstice would be the longest day of the year. But either way, winter solstice is a significant astronomical event in the annual cycle of our planet. And ancient people cared about these kinds of things. They paid attention to them. And obviously, they were trying to explain them often in superstitious ways that went along with their understanding of the world. And so the Romans celebrated Sol Invictus. They celebrated the winter solstice as the rebirth of the unconquered sun. Why? Well, because the sun, which had been getting lower and lower on the horizon for months, would suddenly reverse course and start rising again in the horizon. And the days that had been shortening would start to get longer again. So that meant summer was coming and harvest was coming and everything was going to be all right again. Now, on our calendar, we use the Gregorian calendar, the December solstice happens around the 21st. But according to the calendar that the Romans were using at the time, which was the Julian calendar, winter solstice happened around December 25th, which is obviously the day when we celebrate Christmas today. And so there was also another Roman celebration that we need to talk about, which was the birth of Mithras, who is known as the god of light and truth. And this also happened on December 25th. And of course, this is not nearly as important as a holiday like Saturnalia or Sol Invictus, but I think it's probably relevant because it was a date where a birthday was celebrated and it was the 25th, which is a very important date to us. Then there's one more holiday that I'll mention. It was the New Year's celebration called Calends, which is where we get the word calendar. And it began about a week after Saturnalia ended, and it also lasted for several days. The celebrations included processions and heavy drinking, which actually sounds a lot like our New Year celebrations today, except instead of processions, we have parades. And so we can see that the ancient Romans had a long midwinter holiday season that ran basically from December 17th to around January 5th. Now, obviously, this time of year is the darkest, coldest time of the year. And it also happens to be when one of the most significant astronomical events of the year takes place, winter solstice. And so really, it's not difficult to understand why this has always been a very popular time of year for holidays and celebrations. This should be very easy to understand. People wanted to band together to drown out the darkness and the cold with the warmth of a fire, with eating and drinking and laughing together. And some of the popular decorations were greenery, especially parts of evergreen trees. Now, I'm sure that plants were popular because those evergreens were alive even in the winter. And while all the other plants had died and probably wouldn't be seen again until the spring, evergreens remained green all year long. And the plants like mistletoe and holly were especially popular because not only did they stay green, they also could have fruit during the winter. Lights, usually from candles, were also precious at a time when it was so dark outside. And feasting always puts people in a good mood. So it makes sense that these would just be the obvious elements in any celebration taking place just as people are beginning to settle in for a long winter. Now, we're going to get to the birth of Christmas in a moment, but first we just need to look at a couple of other popular traditions that probably influenced our modern Christmas as well. There was an interesting Norse celebration that was observed in the ancient parts of the world that are now known as Germany and Scandinavia and Great Britain, and this celebration was called Yule. And this was instituted long before Christianity came to the region. It was celebrated in late December, and of course, the people that lived there didn't have written language at the time, so we don't really know a lot of the fine details about how they celebrated their festivals. But from what we can gather, it seems that they had this tradition where a father and a son would go out into the forest and they would bring back the largest log they could carry and they would put it in the house and they would burn it. And this was called the Yule log. And it was able to burn for several days sometimes. Now, also, there was a lot of animal sacrifices that were made during this time of year. And that's probably because they would have been rationing their grains and root vegetables and anything that grew or was seasonal. And so meat's where it was at. And so people, they sacrificed a lot of these animals to their gods, and then they feasted on the meat during Yule. They also drank a lot of ale, and apparently they liked to tell ghost stories while they sat around the fire, which sounds kind of familiar. Here's the way Bruce Forbes, who's a Christmas historian and a Methodist minister, imagines what it must have been like in those frigid northern parts of Europe. He says, imagine yourself huddled in a cabin in the far north as a blizzard rages outside, accompanied by howling winds and strange sounds. It might seem as though creatures or spirits were riding across the sky. Folklore from many areas of Europe provided different stories that would explain the sounds in what became known as the Wild Hunt or Asgard's Ride, end quote. And one of those stories features a god named Odin, who you might recognize from some of the Marvel movies. Odin has one eye and white hair and a beard, and he rides an 8-legged horse that can fly. Oh, and Odin also is leading an army of resurrected warriors who had died in the previous year in battles. He leads them on a hunt during this time of year. So by now, you might be starting to notice some of the themes that are emerging here that bear similarities to what we know as Christmas. For example, you've got the laurel, you got the evergreen trees that were being used in ancient times to celebrate around this time of year. So you might think, could that be where our idea of the Christmas tree came from? And then how about this one? A man with a white beard flying through the sky. Could that be where we get the Santa Claus story from? Now, of course, Santa doesn't have an army of zombies and he's not on a hunt, but still, could parts of the story of Odin have crept into our Christmas lore? Well, we're going to answer some of those questions. But before we just jump to conclusions, we need to take a step back because with the context that I've given you, we want to talk about where Christmas itself came from and how it evolved into the holiday we know today, because all that we've discussed so far are celebrations that predate Christmas. And it's true that they might have potentially influenced Christmas, but just because two things are similar doesn't mean that one caused or even influenced the other one. And so let's talk about when and why and how Christmas got added to the calendar, and also why the date of December 25th was chosen, and what link, if any, these pagan festivals that occurred in late December might have had to do with Christmas. Now, it might come as a surprise to many of you that the church historically did not always celebrate the birth of Christ at all. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. For one thing, we tend to just assume that everybody's always been into birthday celebrations. I mean, in our time, our birthdays are a big deal. But that hasn't always been the case for everyone everywhere throughout history. Actually, the celebrating of birthdays was kind of taught against in the early church. For example, Origen, who was an early Christian theologian, argued that the only biblical characters that celebrated birthdays were Pharaoh and Herod, and they were evil. And Herod beheaded John the Baptist at his birthday party. So birthday parties, he reasoned, were for pagans, not Christians. Now, maybe this gives us some perspective on why there was no Christmas before the 4th century, because in order for Christmas to become a thing, it would have to overcome these kind of negative sentiments within the early church. The turning point came in 312 when the emperor Constantine became a Christian. And when that happened, he put an end to the persecution of the church. And at that time, the church really had been underground the whole time, and they came up from underground and began to develop into a normally functioning organization and even a state-sponsored religion. And so as that process plays out, we begin to see Christian holidays like Christmas becoming part of the church tradition. And probably this happened, at least in part, because of a Christian desire to replace the pagan celebrations, which were very important within the culture, with wholesome Christian holidays that would glorify God. Now, this is an important point that I think a lot of the people that harp on Christmas as being a pagan holiday seem to forget. Christmas itself is not a pagan holiday. Christmas ended up replacing the pagan holidays. If it weren't for Christmas, we might still be celebrating Saturnalia or Sol Invictus, Or we might still be celebrating Odin leading an army of zombies on a hunt. And so one of the beautiful things about Christmas is that the story is so powerful and so compelling that it's basically put all the other competing holidays out of business in the marketplace of the popular imagination. And it's risen to become the dominant celebration this time of year throughout all of Western civilization. And I think we should all be happy whenever the light overwhelms darkness and when something evil is swept away and something godly is put in its place. And by the way, the early Christians did this with a lot of different things. I remember years ago, I visited Rome, and we went to this church called the Pantheon. This is actually a church in Rome that in pre-Christian times was a temple to the Greek and Roman gods. But then when Christianity came along, it started taking over the Roman Empire. And what Christians did is they turned these places of pagan worship into churches. And so this was their mentality. Instead of burning those buildings to the ground, they threw out the old gods and they replaced them with symbols of Christian worship, and they used those temples as churches. And by doing this, they actually said that they were exorcising those temples. Now, of course, we usually think of the word exorcism in connection to casting out demons, but they were using it with reference to replacing false religion with the worship of the one true God. And there's something I really like about the mentality, actually. Now, there's one more possible reason that I'd like to mention that the church instituted the celebration of Christmas. And this is a little more of a theological motive. But one of the most dangerous false teachings that was trying to infiltrate the church during its first 3 centuries was the heresy of Docetism, which is basically the idea that Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. And as early as the late 1st century, we already see John combating this erroneous thinking in his writings. You can read about that in 1 John 4, 2 and 3, when he says that every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. That is the spirit of Antichrist. And notice that Christmas is a holiday that acknowledges that Jesus came in the flesh. It directly contradicts that heretical idea by celebrating Jesus coming in the flesh. So imagine how uncomfortable it must have been for those heretics every Christmas as the church was celebrating and affirming that the Word was made flesh through Christ's virgin birth. So actually, I wonder if Christmas might well be one of the very reasons that Docetism died out. Okay, so there are a number of reasons that the church decided to start celebrating Christmas. And from what I can tell, these were all good and important reasons. But the question remains, why December 25th? Because December was probably not the month that Jesus was born. Well, to be honest, the Bible doesn't tell us explicitly when Jesus was born. Of course, there's some circumstantial pieces of evidence like the fact that the shepherds were outside with their flocks, something that only happens when it's warmer outside. So that suggests that his birth was probably between March and November. I've also heard a pretty compelling case that Jesus might have been born during the Feast of Sukkot, which would be in our September-October timeframe. But that's not really relevant here. The real question we're talking about today is, why did the church decide to celebrate Christmas in December? And there's 2 significant documents that give us clues about this. One tells us that in the 3rd century, there was a guy named Sextus Julius Africanus who picked December 25th as the date. Now, previously, some had theorized that Jesus was born on March 25th because that was the accepted date of creation. And remember, they were using the Julian calendar at the time. And according to that calendar, the spring equinox occurred on March 25th, not March 20th, which is the date it is on our calendar. So again, March 25th was thought of as the day of creation. And so for people in the early church, it only made sense that Jesus, the light of the world, would be born on the same day that God said, "Let there be light." You see, these kind of connections were influential and sometimes compelling to Christians in the early centuries of the church. But then Sextus Julius Africanus comes along and says that March 25th was not the day of Jesus' birth, but the date of his conception. And so if you add 9 months to March 25th, you end up at December 25th. And remember, according to the Julian calendar, December 25th is the day of the winter solstice, when the days start to get longer again. And it's a day when people celebrate the victory of light over darkness. It's a time when some of the most important annual celebrations took place. And I'm sure Christians wanted to see some of those pagan holidays replaced anyway. And so actually there were a lot of good and compelling reasons that December 25th becomes a candidate for the celebration of Christ's birth. But then, after Africanus, more than a century passed before we see any evidence of the church accepting December 25th as the date. In fact, the earliest record that we have of the church adhering to December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth is 336 AD, which is 1 year before the death of Constantine. But interestingly, this document already assumes that date as a fact, which means that the church had already believed this way for some time. So it looks like sometime between the middle of the 3rd and the early part of the 4th century, the church adopted December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth. Okay, so we see a date that was agreed upon, but there's still no mention of a celebration of Christ's birth at this time. But it seems strange that the church would establish a date or agree on a date for the birth of Jesus and not celebrate it. So most historians just assume that Christmas began to be celebrated around the same time, that December 25th timeframe, and that is when it was established as Jesus' birthday. So a lot of people post podcasts and do documentaries. You can find this all over the internet, where they assume that the only reason the church chose December 25th for Christmas is because it wanted to compete with Saturnalia. It wanted to provide, a godly alternative to a pagan holiday. For example, when Forbes lists the reasons why the church decided on December 25th, the first one says, quote, Christmas was started to compete with rival Roman religions, end quote. Now, this is one possible explanation, but obviously it's not that simple. First, there's no evidence at all that I'm aware of that December 25th was chosen because of any pagan holidays. That's just an assumption. And like I'm showing you, even if it was a factor, we have documented evidence that there were other good reasons as well that have nothing to do with paganism and nothing to do with any pagan religions for the reason why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Forbes says that it was Emperor Constantine's attempt to provide a holiday to rival those of the pagans so they would be willing to become Christians. But that's just pure speculation. We don't have any documentation that Constantine used Christmas for this purpose whatsoever. In fact, we don't even know for sure that Constantine was emperor when the church decided on that date for Christmas. If any circumstantial evidence could be presented in favor of Christmas being intentionally placed among the pagan winter holidays, it would just be that Christmas absorbed some of the popular traditions associated with those pagan holidays, especially associating with Saturnalia. But that shouldn't be surprising that some of the popular traditions remained part of the celebration in a culture where those traditions were deeply ingrained. I mean, look, I love Christmas trees. I don't worship them. They have no pagan connection in my mind whatsoever, but I like the lights and I like the smell of pine. It conjures warm, happy, sentimental memories and feelings. That's what traditions do. And provided these aren't evil or demonic in and of themselves, why shouldn't we be free to enjoy them? In our gospel crusades in Africa, one of the things we do each week is that we burn witchcraft paraphernalia that people bring after they become Christians. And these are usually things that are given to people by the witch doctors, like fetishes and charms and amulets that are either worn on the body or hung on the home to ward off evil spirits or grant protection or blessing or something. Sometimes they'll also bring idols or objects that are part of their animistic worship practices. There could be rocks or pieces of wood, a root, a stump, all kinds of things that they believed that some spirit lived in. And sometimes they also bring like books or other instruments that have been used or are intended to be used in various witchcraft rituals. And we burn these things. And we do this according to the example that you find in Acts 19, where it says that in Ephesus, after the people became Christians, the ones that practiced magic arts brought their books and burned them in front of everybody. I remember one time there was a white European journalist that accused us of destroying the culture of the locals. And I remember some of the African pastors that we were with were highly offended by that. They said, this is not our culture. This is witchcraft. And then Reiner Bonke was there and he responded by saying something like, we respect culture, but we don't respect the devil. And every culture is good provided we kick the devil out of it. And that's what had to happen in the Greco-Roman world and later on throughout Europe as the gospel spread into these heathen lands. They had to kick the devil out. But that doesn't mean that they had to throw away every element of every culture and every tradition. Some things are not inherently good or bad. Look, God created evergreen trees, not the devil. The devil owns nothing. And guess what? I refuse to give him what doesn't belong to him. So again, we have no document from the early church that explicitly connects Christmas with one or more of the popular Roman pagan holidays. And so even though some of the specific traditions may or may not be vestigial remnants of some various old pagan holidays, we definitely cannot say for sure that pagan festivals are the origin of Christmas. Now, for some people, especially the more conspiracy theory-oriented types, as soon as they see that Christmas and pagan festivals occur during the same time of year, and they notice that there's some traditions that are similar between the two, they immediately make the connection and insist that one caused the other. And this is where it becomes important to just stick to the evidence and not make connections just because they make sense in our mind. Otherwise, we run the risk of straying into what is known as parallelomania, which is a fallacy that occurs when someone assumes that one source borrowed from another source strictly on the basis that both have similarities to one another. Listen, just because there are similarities between two things doesn't mean that one was borrowing from the other. It's possible that both could be drawing from a third source. It's also possible that the similarities are strictly coincidental. This was a common error that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the world of liberal biblical criticism. There were some liberal scholars that found similarities between early Christianity and paganism, and they started claiming that the early church actually borrowed from the pagans to produce some of their doctrines. And they even famously argued that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, but that the church borrowed the story of the resurrection from the mystery religions that also spoke of dying and rising gods. And obviously, these liberal scholars were wrong. And later 20th century scholarship proved those theories terribly wrong and sloppy and biased. So let's not make that same error by assuming that the church borrowed from paganism in the establishment of Christmas as a holiday and in its adaptation of December 25th as the date for Christmas. Unless there is actual evidence to support that conclusion, we can't assert it as if we know it's true. And just realize that anybody who talks about this as if they know that it's true, they're just full of baloney. People love to talk about things they don't know all the time. And it seems like this is more a problem than ever because of the way that social media has just given everyone a platform and everybody gets a voice. And unfortunately, often it's the more shocking and sensational voices and the more shocking, sensational theories that get the people's attention, especially if they voice that nonsense confidently and persuasively. So just don't be so easily manipulated. Now, again, to be perfectly clear, it may or may not be true that the date of pagan holidays was factored into the decision made in the 4th century. But we can't be sure about this. We just simply don't know. But even if it was a factor, it most certainly was not the only and probably not even the primary factor.